Hey everybody, Matt Yonkovit, Head of Open Source Strategy here at Percona with another episode of The Hoss, that's me, Talks Foss. Yes, we're here to give you the best in the open source space. Today we've got an extra special episode, so we love it that you've tuned in to watch. So I'm here with Lukas Eder, the founder and CEO of JooQ, JooQ. Hi Lukas, how are you doing today?
Great, how are you doing, Matt?
Great, wonderful. So I saw your framework out there and was really intrigued. And I know that as a DBA, as someone who's come from the database background, I always had to deal with, problem queries. I always had to deal with applications that were of concern. And a lot of times the problem ended up being the ORM. And a lot of times it ended up being Hibernate. And so I'm sure that you've experienced that as well, because...
Well, can I quote you on that?
Yeah, you can quote me on that all you want. So I've noticed that, Hibernate and ORMs like Ruby and Rails and other ORMs tend to have problems generating efficient query. And so that's why JooQ was so interesting. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about JooQ. I'm sure that a lot of people that I work with, that I deal with, would be very interested in, what JooQ is and how it works.
Yeah, excellent. So JooQ is an alternative. So essentially what it really does is it's an internal domain-specific language that models the SQL language as a language inside of Java. So you can use the Java compiler to type check your SQL queries instead of having it externally to Java. So alternatives that used to exist before were like JDBC. With JDBC, you have just strings you can pass around. There are other utilities like MyBatis and other libraries, but JooQ really models the entire SQL language as a Java API. And it has a code generator that generates your database schema. So that means whenever you rename something, your queries won't compile. Just like when you have views inside of your database, you have dynamic SQL in JooQ. So that's what JooQ does. It's not really rocket science. It's just merely an internal diesel, which exists in a lot of languages. But I think JooQ is the most sophisticated that has ever been created of this kind. So JooQ has been around for 12 years now, and now supports about 25 relational database dialects and a lot of features of all the different vendors.
And what I really saw interesting was you have the capability to really refine the SQL code itself. With Hibernate, there's a limited amount of options that you have, and it looks like you have a lot more capabilities to build deeper, richer SQL statements and really get into a lot more fine-grained detail.
So the idea of JooQ is you actually want to write SQL, but you want to write SQL in Java. And you don't want to have it external to Java, but internal to Java. But you want to write exactly what you like, an inner join, an outer join, whatever kind of union, whatever kind of operator, lateral join, or something really fancy like JSON or XML nested in SQL. And you want to write exactly that. And JooQ will help you write exactly that by removing all the I'd say, ugly parts of SQL. So some of the ugly parts of SQL are the syntax is kind of weird. So it's not a very modern syntax. It's not very composable. So if you want to have dynamic SQL, for instance, and it's a frequent requirement, where you have a subquery that you only want to join under certain conditions, This is super easy with JooQ, and you will never run into any syntax errors because you forgot that in this database product, you have to add parentheses around this subquery, or you have to name your derived table X or Y or whatever. JooQ will handle all of these little things, but give you all the strength of SQL at the same time without hiding it. So that's the main difference.
Yeah, that's fair.
I say you said.
I was going to say that's JPA, very cool.
Yeah, thanks. Well, you said Hibernate generates bad SQL at times. I don't think Hibernate actually does that. Hibernate generates good SQL, but the difficulty is it doesn't give you that control that JooQ does, for instance. So if you know exactly, I want to have this kind of query and I need these 5 tables here. And with Hibernate, sometimes it's difficult to foresee what kind of joins are going to be produced. Well, obviously, with experience, you can foresee that. But it's a junior developer might not know this, and maybe the code already ships to production, and you haven't noticed that you're joining too much or too little or whatever. And the queries will do the correct thing, but maybe not efficiently. And with JooQ, from the beginning, you actually have to design your queries.
Right. And with JooQ and the difference between Hibernate and JooQ and some ORMs, a lot of ORMs, you'll define the schema as the classes, and then it will build the database and the schema in the back end for you.
Yeah.
It's bring your schema to JooQ, right?
Exactly. So the idea of JooQ is the fact that you're using Java is maybe temporary even. So maybe tomorrow or in a year or two you want to use JavaScript or whatever, but your database will stay. So I'm with this background. I'm a very SQL-oriented person, a very relational-oriented person, as they used to have a lot of people in the 90s, but it's a bit more rare today. But from experience, I really think data has mass. So I'm quoting no, it's not Connor McDonald. I forgot who it said by Oracle, but data has mass. So data actually sits there and is inert, and your application can move very quickly. You can redesign your application very quickly, but you're not going to redesign your database very quickly. So chances are that a legacy system has a schema that will not change easily, and you want to have the schema as the source of truth, not your Java code. So it's a different mindset. For instance, when you want to prototype stuff, having Java code as the source of truth or whatever in the client might be faster in the prototyping phase. But even when you're using JPA, I think you want to switch to the database first approach at some point, because that stuff is going to stay, and maybe your client design might change.
And I think
another thing that happens frequently in my jobs is maybe you have a Java client and a Python client or whatever for some scripting, and you don't want to work with a schema that is not nicely designed with DDL.
Yeah, and I think that the query design and schema design is actually becoming more and more a lost art, which is a shame, because that's where you can get a lot more performance and scalability with your applications.
Absolutely.
It's
absolutely.
Yeah. And so
I've noticed this when I did the SQL training. So I used to have only a training about SQL language features like window functions and performance. And then I added a third day of training about normalization. I thought no one was going to buy that, because everyone already knows, right? This is old stuff. Maybe some junior developers might be interested. But you'd be surprised how many people actually wanted to learn or relearn how to properly normalize a schema, how to get to third normal form. This is, as you say, it's a lost art.
And that's a shame, because where I have seen the most performance benefit, the most scalability, the most security actually is in that designing of the schema and designing of the actual database architecture. But now we've moved into this phase where everything is cloud-oriented, database as a service. Everybody wants it easy as they can get it. And that's great, except people start to lose those skills. And the funny thing is, when you start to lose those skills, your databases become bigger, they become less flexible. And as that happens, you spend more money, because now all of a sudden, your tables are 10 times the size in the cloud. You pay per gigabyte and everything else. So it's kind of a crazy dynamic.
And every time you have to migrate your data, you have a lot more complex migrations instead of just adding and dropping a little bit of data.
Yeah.
So you have even that, right?
Yeah.
More data transfer as well.
Yeah. It's a slippery slope there. It really is. Now, JooQ, it is a fully supported product. It's open source, so anybody can go download it today. And if they need help, you have a model that is, offers support for folks who are looking for help as well, correct?
Yeah, so there's community support on Stack Overflow or GitHub, which is free of charge, but of course no guarantees. And paying customers, regardless of the database product they're using, if they're a paying customer, they get premium support by email directly. So usually people don't actually need support for JooQ because it's just SQL. So it's kind of, the goal is it's really straightforward. If you know SQL, you know JooQ, but obviously we help people get their SQL queries right all the time. So that still happens.
So you do a lot of the support you do is SQL help?
Yeah, but it's not a very support-intensive product, I'd say. From the beginning, I've tried to focus my marketing on people who actually appreciate SQL. So I did some ranting about JPA in the past, how JooQ is better and blah, blah, but I think I've grown past that kind of marketing, and I'm not marketing JooQ for advertising JooQ as a good product for people who like an ORM. I mean, if you want to work with your objects and your object graph, then please use an ORM. But if you want to work with SQL, I think then JooQ is going to be a good solution. And those people already know a lot of SQL, and they will find JooQ just perfect for them because it lets them do exactly what they want, but in a more type-safe way. So it's not really a support business like other open source businesses, which is kind of mean, right? So to make money, we actually have to have commercial licenses, I think, because it's such a great product.
Okay. And, what license is this released under right now?
So the open source edition is Apache 2.0 license.
Okay. So it's very permissive. I know a lot of people right now are moving in exploring the different licenses. So having a permissive license, in my opinion, works out to your favor because you'll get more people to adopt. So are you seeing?
Yes, of course.
Are you seeing a lot of adoption so far in a lot of enterprises? Is that a space that has started to take notice?
Yes, of course. I don't know who is using the open source edition. They obviously don't tell me, but the paying customers, they're from all sorts of companies, including Fortune 100s. And I think JooQ is being used everywhere by now. So I've seen different surveys in the past. Like 5 years ago, I think JooQ had about between 4 and 6% market share compared to Hibernate, which has maybe 40 or 50. Some market share for JDBC, pure JDBC applications. And from my download and customer statistics, that has grown. I haven't seen another survey that actually checked on SQL frameworks because it's gone a bit out of fashion to ask about that. So these surveys typically ask about cloud and these kind of things. Yeah. But I think the market share should be around 7-8% now. So it's quite big. Everyone who is really into this topic is using JooQ now.
Very cool.
There's hardly any alternative in this domain, so in this niche.
So in your experience, and you've done SQL coding for a long time, and you've helped people, design things, you've given training. What would you say is the number one problem that developers continually fall into when trying to build their databases and design their applications when it comes to SQL?
I think the number one problem is to not version control their database from the beginning. So they want to just try around a little bit and add some table here and some table there. And before they know it, they go live with some create table scripts, and it's a complete mess. So they don't think about how to increment their database schema. And if you have to do that after the fact, it's much harder to get it right. So I think the number one problem for developers is to, from the beginning, use something like Liquibase or Flyway or whatever tool helps you be very diligent and very careful about your database schema design, of course, as we discussed earlier, but also evolution. So the database schema evolution is one of the still, I think, unsolved problems. So Flyway offers a lot of simple tooling to just get the database increment scripts in the right order, but it's just very script-based, so you can do everything the database can do, but it's script-based. You have to do everything manually. Liquibase offers a little bit more help with the XML or YAML or JSON format, I think, what they're doing. And so you have some abstraction over the dialects and syntax and maybe a little bit easier to manage. But you have to do a lot of stuff manually. I think there's still room for a new vendor to solve problems in this area. But even if that's not available yet, you should think about how to properly increment your database changes and version control them. So it's really weird that we're using version control for all languages, but not for SQL. I kind of don't understand that, right?
Yeah, this is true. And I think this has driven a lot of people over to the NoSQL camp, where their claim is, oh, it's schemaless, until you run into performance problems and scalability issues. Then all of a sudden, the first thing is, oh, well, you didn't design the schema properly.
Yeah, and it's not schemaless at all. I mean, I tend to not use that term. It's very misleading. I tend to distinguish between a schema on write, which is like relational databases, where you have a schema enforcement when you write to the database, whereas NoSQL databases are often schema on read. You have a schema. It's just discovered when you read the database, right? But there it is. You get the schema and you discover it on the fly.
Yes.
right? So
Yeah.
I think it's better to enforce it when you write, so you know exactly what's in the database.
Okay.
But that's just us, right?
Yeah.
we know these things.
Yeah.
We appreciate these things, but of course, again, it makes it harder to prototype and I mean, if you want to move fast in the beginning of a project, getting this part right is the hardest part, because you have to do a lot more upfront work than if you have something like a NoSQL database where you can just dump everything into a box and then throw it away and then dump it in the next box as you evolve your product before you go live. But again, if you start planning for your schema evolution from the beginning, then this is not going to be a problem in the long run.
Okay, great. And if people want to help with JooQ and they want to, either contribute, provide, open up bugs, how do they get involved in the community?
The best way is on GitHub for bugs or the mailing list for questions. So it's not much of an open source project in the classical sense where there's a lot of contributors. So contributors are usually people who report bugs, of course. We always appreciate that. But for instance, the tests are not open source, so you can't just make a pull request and run our integration test and see if you're still doing it right. So that's part of the business model, to not open source the tests, kind of like SQLite does. I don't know if you've seen that. But SQLite has some tests open and some tests closed, which helps Richard Hipp keep control over the intellectual property. So we don't have to test open source. So this means a lot of people don't actually contribute code. The other reason is I actively discourage this contributing code, because I think the way GitHub handles this is hardly ever the right way. Everyone could just dump some code on GitHub and ask the maintainers to please merge that. And it's a lot of work. And contributors usually don't actually know the roadmap, don't know how feature X interacts with feature Y, and they're actually not skilled enough to do that work. And it's the best way is usually not to contribute code, but to contribute ideas, to contribute use cases, to document stuff, to say, okay, this is a clutch. How can I do this better? Actually, just ordinary customer support cases is the way we like to receive contributions in the best way. I think that's the best way to interact.
Yeah, and honestly,
with most open source.
Yeah, honestly, what I've seen is the best contributions to most open source projects end up being feedback, like the testing, the documentation on how to use it, educational materials, things like that. Great.
Absolutely. And you can even host that yourself. I mean, if you write blog posts, I mean, that's very helpful. It's your point of view. It's your different angle and a different perspective on a product that a vendor would never write this way. And that's maybe very helpful for someone else.
Yeah. Okay. Right? Well, Lukas, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate you taking, a little bit of your time to explain JooQ and where it's at. I really enjoyed our quick conversation here, and I appreciate you coming on.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt.
All right. Wow, what a great episode that was. We really appreciate you coming and checking it out. We hope that you love open source as much as we do. If you like this video, go ahead and subscribe to us on the YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And of course, tune in to next week's episode. We really appreciate you coming and talking open source with us.